Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us at our event at the Cato Institute today titled A Costly Distraction, U.S.-China Competition in the Middle East. My name is Lawrence Montreal. I'm a Senior Director of Government Affairs here at the Cato Institute, and I'm honored to moderate what promises to be an interesting discussion today. We're convened at a moment when U.S. policymakers increasingly view the Middle East through the lens of great power competition, namely with China. From Washington, there's mounting concern that Beijing is expanding its footprint diplomatically, economically, and to a lesser extent militarily, and that as a result, U.S. influence might be under threat. But is this framing accurate? Is it helpful in making policy decisions? And perhaps more importantly, how much does it really matter to the United States? After all, the region accounts for about 4% of global GDP and only about 6% of the global population. No country is poised to become a regional hegemon, and the U.S. is no longer reliant on the Middle East for energy. In fact, since about 2018, the U.S. has been the largest oil producer in the world. While the last four administrations have campaigned on promises to reduce America's presence in the Middle East, the U.S. has, in fact, remained deeply engaged. At present, there's about 40,000 troops, at least that we know of, scattered across 9 different countries, to include a sizable naval contingent in the form of the U.S. Fifth Fleet. The traditional rationales for expansive U.S. presence in the Middle East have been oil, counterterrorism, and regional stability, but they have been increasingly supplanted by a perceived threat to U.S. dominance by Beijing. Today, we'll look at the issue of great power competition in the Middle East through 3 primary lenses. First, what are China's real interests, capabilities, and ambitions in the region? Second, what are the risks of warranting U.S. policy on competition with China? And third, what would an alternative strategy and defense posture look like in the region? To answer these questions, I'm joined today by 3 very talented analysts. On my near right here, we have Jennifer Cavanaugh, who's a Senior Fellow and Director of Military Analysis at Defense Priorities. Her research focuses on U.S. military strategy, force structure, and defense budgeting, the defense industrial base, U.S. military deployments, and interventions. Previously, Jennifer was a Senior Fellow in the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She also worked at the RAND Corporation as a political scientist and led RAND's Army Strategy Program. She has an AB in government from Harvard University, a PhD in political science and public policy from the University of Michigan. She's a term member on the Council of Foreign Relations, as well as an adjunct professor in security studies at Georgetown University. Also joining us today is Rose Kalanick, who's the Director of the Middle East Program at Defense Priorities. She's published widely on energy security, great power politics, U.S. grand strategy in the Middle East. Her work has appeared in a number of outlets ranging from foreign affairs to security studies, the New York Times and the Washington Post. Rose's book, Black Gold and Black Mail, Oil and Great Power Politics, explains the differences in any energy security strategies adopted by great powers, and her edited volume, Crude Strategy, Rethinking the U.S. Military Commitment to Defend Persian Gulf Oil, urges a reprisal of U.S. engagement in the region. She spent 10 years teaching political science at the University of Notre Dame and Williams College. She has a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago and a BA from Bryn Mawr College. Down on the far right, we're joined by my colleague John Hoffman, who's a research fellow here at the Cato Institute. His research focuses on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East geopolitics, and political Islam. His work similarly has been featured in a number of academic and policy-oriented journals, to include Foreign Policy, the Washington Post, the National Interest, Middle East Policy, and more. He has a PhD in political science, an MA in Middle East and Islamic Studies, and a BA in global affairs, all from George Mason University. They got their tuition dollars out of John, quite clearly. So before we hop into the discussion, just some quick logistical notes. We're going to have a guided dialogue here on stage, and then we will turn to Q&A from the audience, both in person and online. We'll be taking questions online. You can join the conversation and submit questions directly. I think we already have a few populating here on the event webpage, Facebook, YouTube, or X. At this time, for those joining us in person, if anybody has their cell phone on them, which I'm sure you likely do, if you could just make sure that is on silent. So with that, we'll hop into the discussion. And Rose, why don't we start with you? Your analysis asserts that China is structurally incapable of dominating the Middle East. You cite limited expeditionary power or force projection capabilities, risk aversion, and dependence on U.S. secured trade routes. So a two-part question to start things off here. Why do so many in Washington overstate China's ambitions in the region? And how does the growing challenges posed by Chinese influence compared to the threat posed by the Soviet Union during the Cold War?
Yeah, great questions. And before I answer, just thanks so much for having me today, John and Lawrence and everybody here at Cato, and thanks for coming out to see the event virtually or in person. So a couple of thoughts on that. Why does Washington misunderstand this problem or overstate the problem? I think there's two main reasons. The first reason is that there's a whole range of assumptions that are sort of holdovers from the Cold War that have become axiomatic and completely divorced from the conditions that gave rise to them. And American policymakers just have no understanding that that's the case. So it's axiomatically taken as bad if China's involvement or investment or influence in the region is increasing because the assumption is there's some kind of zero-sum conflict with them. And that's an assumption that really dates back to Cold War days, even though the situation is totally different. The other blind spot that I think policymakers in Washington have is that they don't understand the ways in which our own presence in the region is affecting China and threatening them, right? And so in the paper that I wrote earlier this summer on the U.S.-China rivalry or relationship in the Middle East, I looked at the Cold War example because it's really easy, I think, if you just start at the baseline of today, to look at what China's doing and think, wow, maybe that's a little bit scary. They're doing more stuff. Shouldn't we be worried? But analytically, I want to know, how worried should we be compared to, I don't know, the last time that we had to worry about great power rivalry in the region, which was the Cold War. And the situation is just completely different and much, much, much less threatening than the Cold War, even though our response is much greater. So during the Cold War, the Soviet Union posed a real military threat to the Middle East. And they posed a military threat because they bordered the Middle East. They shared a 1,200-mile border with Iran. They were meddling in Iran on a regular basis. They occupied it during World War II, didn't want to leave. It was one of the first crises of the Cold War, all this kind of stuff. So they posed an actual military threat to the region, and that mattered because the U.S. worried about having access to oil from the region in some kind of conflict with the Soviet Union. But the other way that they threatened the region is that they weren't part of the global international oil market. Right? Today, we have this worldwide market that China is a part of. The Soviet Union was not. We didn't have a unified market. And so the Soviets had their own system for trading oil internally with Comecon, other communist countries. And it was possible that if they did gain influence over these oil-producing countries, that they could somehow maybe lean on them or convince them not to sell it to the rest of the world because there were these sort of bifurcated systems that don't exist today. Yet, even though there were this actual threat, the U.S. didn't have bases in the region, right? We had a symbolic presence in Bahrain, and that's about it until the early 80s when we started actually investing more in the region. By contrast, China is much less threatening, and yet we have a huge amount of troops in the region based there permanently. And in fact, it's the fact that we have those forces that China finds threatening and is why they have, to the extent that they have, potentially flirted with having a military presence. I think it's driven by the fact that the U.S. has a presence, and that's frightening to them.
Thanks for that, Rose.
Yeah.
John, you've written about the traditional rationales for U.S. deep engagement in the region, as I stated earlier, being oil, counterterrorism, and regional stability. Are those relevant today? And if not, what are the U.S. vital interests in the region, and how do they relate to China, if at all?
Sure. I would say those three interests do still compromise kind of America's bottom line in the Middle East. But these three interests, I often argue in the paper talking about China, are often distorted when the United States superimposes these grand narratives onto its U.S. Middle East policy, whether it be the Cold War, the global war on terror, or now Cold War 2.0. But I would say the zero-sum framework that the United States appears to be adopting on competition with China really inhibits Washington's ability to see that our chief interests, these three that we just mentioned, are rather limited and they're rather easy to accomplish. As Rose was explaining about the changing international oil markets, the lack really of an effective oil weapon, regional hegemon. And I would argue that there is no actor in the Middle East capable of achieving such dominance, nor does China desire or have an ability to achieve such dominance. So when you take a step back and divorce yourself from this zero-sum framework, you start to see that the means by which U.S. Middle East policy is operating right now doesn't really fit the limited ends that we should be operating on.
And Jennifer, in your independent assessment of U.S. global military posture, you assert that the fundamental problem with U.S. posture in the Middle East today is that it's far too large for the interests at stake. What does U.S. force posture look like currently in the region, and how has that evolved over time? And secondarily, how does it compare to the Chinese military footprint in the region?
Yeah, well, as you noted in the intro, the United States has about 40 to 45,000 forces in the region right now. That's up about 10,000 from where it started at the beginning of the Biden administration. Biden increased a U.S. forward presence in the region not only after October 7th, 2023, but even before, with an eye towards Iran. That posture is spread across about 20 sites in the region, both air bases, the ground forces, and then you have the naval presence. So I'll just give you some numbers here. There won't be a test, but just to give you a sense of sort of the magnitude of this force presence. There's about 13,500 forces in Kuwait, 8,000 in Bahrain, 10,000 in Qatar. We still have 2,000 forces in Iraq, 2,500 in Saudi Arabia, 5,000 in UAE, about 1,000 still in Syria. Now, and then we have the naval presence. At times there have been 2 carrier strike groups in the region. Even when there's only one, there's sometimes one also operating in the Mediterranean. And you have multiple fighter squadrons, attack aircraft. So this is a massive military presence. Now this is, believe it or not, a significant decrease from where it was during the height of the Iraq War when we had over 100,000 forces in the region. But it is really no different, if anything, it's a little bit higher than what U.S. presence was back before the Iraq War in, say, 2002. And the U.S. presence has been pretty steady going back to the first Gulf War. As Rose indicated, we started building up in the 80s, but after that first Gulf War, which was often seen as a big success, it also ushered in sort of the era of long-term U.S. military presence in the region. There's other metrics to think about U.S. presence in the region. One is arms sales. Over 50% of arms sales to the region come from the United States. U.S. security assistance to the Middle East is larger than any other region in the billions of dollars, driven primarily by countries like Egypt and Israel, which get the largest amount of foreign military financing of any countries in the world. So I think it's fair to say here that there's really been no retrenchment. Even though every president has run on retrenching from the Middle East, there has been none. And even in the current Trump administration, we've seen very little change. Syria presence is down a little, Iraq presence is down a little, but definitely not to zero. If you flip that and look at the Chinese military presence, I mean, it's effectively zero. They have one base in Djibouti, has about 1,000 forces. Djibouti is not actually in the Middle East, but it borders the Red Sea. And at this base, there's no aircraft carriers, there's no fighter jets, primarily houses logistics, helicopters, UAVs. They are building the infrastructure, which indicates potentially they might try to move things. But as Rose indicated, they don't have expeditionary capabilities right now. So getting forces there is not going to be that easy for them. And they haven't used this presence for anything. Even when the Houthis were firing missiles into the Red Sea right nearby, they basically did nothing. In fact, they paid the Houthis off so their ships could keep sailing through that waterway. In terms of other posture, they have a dual-use facility, maybe, in UAE. There's some evidence that they are trying to build one. And they do have commercial ports throughout the region that they do own. Under Chinese law, these could be potentially used for military operations, but transitioning commercial infrastructure to military infrastructure is not easy. They need different types of docking facilities and things like that, so even that would be hard. The last thing I think is worth talking about is that there is an argument out there that people like Isaac Cardin and Sheena Greitens have made that China's approach to spreading its security footprint is not dominated by military but by police, that they look at regime security and they have this global security initiative. And that's true. They are quite active in parts of the world in this area. But if you look at the data on the Middle East, they're actually not that active, which is quite interesting to me because you would think that with these absolute monarchies and that you have in the Middle East, this would be a clear area of commonality where these regimes would be looking to China for help in this regime security area, and they're really not. These countries are participants, sort of, in the global security initiative. They don't really have Chinese police training programs or any types of activities in this way. China does have some defense production with the Saudis, drones particularly, ballistic missiles, areas where the United States will not sell technology to the Saudi government. This is an area where I think math is often misused. People say, well, Chinese arms sales have increased 500%. But 500% of a really small number is still a really small number. And so this is where I think people inflate the presence. So, just to summarize, U.S. presence in the Middle East is massive, which is why we keep getting dragged in, because anything that happens implicates the United States. The Chinese military presence is infinitesimally small in comparison. Their security presence is small, and their actual activities are even smaller.
So this one's open to the panel here. I mean, how do you assess China's interests and ambitions in the Middle East, and what are some factors limiting those ambitions? I think, Jennifer, you alluded to their limited military footprint, but is there anything else that limits those ambitions?
Sure, I can go. I would say that their ambitions and their aims in the Middle East are inherently limited. There's actually a great deal of overlap between the United States and China when you really look at it objectively. China considers and views the Middle East primarily as a market. China is the largest oil consumer, investor, and trade partner in the region. So they share America's interest in the free flow of oil out of the region, for example. They share America's interest in trying to curtail the region as being a hotbed of terrorism. Of course, Beijing has, in many ways, domestically manipulated that term, a phenomenon of many states during the GWAT era. But going back to the limited ability of China to project force in the region, I think that's what's critical. China has 5 regional theater commands for its military, all of which are focused either domestically or on its near abroad. Its ability to project power into the Middle East isn't even comparable to the United States. And that's where I think is what's really important is even if there was an underlying desire to dominate the region, which I don't think there is, I think they've learned from our mistake, the ability to do so just isn't there at the moment.
Yeah, I think that it's really important that the Chinese have learned from U.S. mistakes. Who looking at U.S. strategy in the Middle East over the past 30 years is that's a winning strategy. Let me repeat that. China has no desire to be a global hegemon or definitely not a regional hegemon in the Middle East. And again, I'll go back to the Red Sea example. This is a case where the U.S. actually asked China for help, asked China to help to curtail the Houthi activities in the Red Sea, and China said no, because China's interests were not served in that way. China is willing to act to protect its own interests, but unlike the United States, it is not willing to bear the costs of a global system or even a regional system if it does not advance its interests, and that's a big difference from the way the U.S. has pursued its strategy in the Middle East and elsewhere. I think that's a big limit on what they're willing to do. Most Chinese activity in the region is economic. They're looking for economic activities and opportunities, especially in the AI and tech space, and to the extent that they have security forces in the region, they're to protect those economic investments, whether it's to protect infrastructure construction or other types of facilities.
Yeah, I would add to that too. As somebody who's studied energy and oil for a couple of decades now, 10 years ago, there was a lot of concern that China was going to increase their military footprint because they were relying so heavily on Middle Eastern oil, would continue to rely heavily on Middle Eastern oil. China produces like 4 million barrels a day, but they consume 4 times that, so they have these huge imports. And so I think a lot of us were expecting China to become drawn into the region in a greater way, and that really hasn't happened. And I think one of the reasons it hasn't happened that's sort of misunderstood or not really noted on is just how much China is actually sort of getting off of oil as a major fuel. Their investment in EVs is just extraordinary. It's been extraordinarily successful. And I now see their strategy, like their main energy security strategy isn't that they're going to compete with the U.S. militarily to try to defend Chinese shipments of oil from the Persian Gulf to China. They're just trying to get off the stuff in general, and they're having enormous success in doing that. So their oil consumption is plateauing this decade and going down, which for a country at their level of economic development, they're kind of like mixed, but in many ways they're still a developing country. Usually developing countries are really reliant on fossil fuels and oil, and they're going the opposite direction. So, I think they're going to like leapfrog the Middle East entirely as being important to their economy, and it seems to me more and more that it's less important than their strategy, and certainly less important than we thought it would be like 10 years ago, before all these EV investments really paid off.
We've talked a little bit about the Chinese response to the Houthi campaign in the Red Sea, but what about other recent crises, whether it's Gaza or Iran? What can they tell us and the Chinese response to those about their ambitions in the Middle East?
Yeah, I think it's a perfect example of how Beijing has sought to avoid entanglements in the Middle East. They've compartmentalized their policies, this kind of friends with all, enemies with none approach, and they tried to remain above the different competing factions in the Middle East, different strategic rivalries. And you see that over the past 2 years following Hamas's terrorist attack on October 7th and the ensuing war in Gaza and spread to the rest of the region. You see that China is hands-off. They often, I call it performative politics, often engage in, saying, we need a two-state solution, or, we'll host a bunch of Arab leaders and talk about the need to do a two-state solution. It's very similar to when China helped broker Saudi-Iran rapprochement. It looks great on the surface, but when you really look at in the details, there's no Chinese desire to enforce these agreements or to police them in any meaningful way. So I think it shows a general aversion to getting entangled in the region's conflicts. Again, I think learning from the United States, remaining laser focused on pursuing its interests and not getting drawn into different regional conflicts.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think that the Iran war over the summer is a really hugely important case, because there's, and it's continued, there's all this sort of hand-wringing about what I, refer to facetiously as the quadrilateral of doom, right? This, I've forgotten which axis it is, because there's like resistance, upheaval, autocracies, yeah. Everything's an axis, But so like, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, right? Crank, as it's sometimes referred to. Like, this just, I know. This just goes to show like how totally bankrupt that idea is, right? So Iran gets attacked by Israel and is in this major war for 12 days, and China does nothing to help it, literally nothing. I mean, it's just completely absent, right? It doesn't want to get involved in it whatsoever, and it doesn't seem to have, it doesn't even have the sense that it needs to show that, like, its proxy state or its sort of pet state in the region would, win in a war or any of this kind of stuff, right? Like, they're just completely removed from the situation entirely. And it's not surprising to me that there's very little, like, there's much less than meets the eye in that relationship, but it was just shown in a very stark way with how little the Chinese did to help during and since.
I mean, I think it's a good example of the Chinese being unwilling to put their own interests at stake to help another country. Whereas if you look at the United States, it was willing to expend years' worth of air defense missiles for Israel, like totally different model of foreign policy. And I also think that this is another area where people misunderstand how China sees the overall international system, right? There's this idea that China wants to overthrow the US-led rules-based order, in quotes, or whatever's left of it. And that's sort of true, but they also benefit from the current international order. So they're not Russia, right? Russia just wants to sow chaos. China actually benefits from certain parts of the international order, so there are limits to how far it will go in all of these areas, even in its cooperation with Russia in the Ukraine war. There have been clear limits in its willingness to violate the U.S. sanctions. They've tried to stick at least to the gray area so they can be seen as sort of law-abiding. To the extent that they got involved in other types of things like Gaza and the war in Iran, it's mainly been to point out U.S. hypocrisy, to point out that, once again, here's the United States bombing a sovereign country and imposing unilateral sanctions and things like this. So if anything, it's played into China's narrative that it's not the United States that's the preserver of global order anymore, but it's China that's upholding global order, and it's the United States that's the revisionist power. So to the extent that they have been involved, it's been trying to spin these narratives. Again, it's not about militarily getting themselves entangled.
So we've established that China has strong economic interests in the region, at least for the time being, whether it's securing energy corridors to the Persian Gulf or the U.S. ensuring safe passage of their goods on their way to Europe through the Red Sea during the Houthi campaign. But how does China react if the U.S. does reverse course in the Middle East and decrease their footprint and is less engaged?
I mean, I think it depends what type of engagement we're talking about. I think if the U.S. reduces its economic engagement, China would seize on that opportunity to expand its economic footprint, and we've seen that. But that's different than its military footprint. If the U.S. pulled back militarily, I don't think China would do anything. There's just not that much that it can do right now. It's not going to build bases in the region. That's not its model. It's not going to send military forces to the region. That's not its model. It's possible that they might try to increase arms sales, but I guess I don't see a world where the United States pulls back its arms sales, even if it pulls back its troops. So I guess to me, and even if they did, let's say they do increase their military presence, is that really a threat to the United States? I would say no. U.S. interests in the region are secure for a lot of reasons that have nothing to do with the U.S. military presence. I've argued elsewhere, I feel this about all regions, but the United States could reduce its military presence almost to zero, I think, in the Middle East and still have its security interests well protected. And it wouldn't matter what China and Russia did. U.S. interests would still be protected.
Yeah, I agree. And I think China's very unlikely to try to do anything militarily if the United States left. If we're worried about the vacuum argument, right? If the U.S. leaves, there'll be a vacuum for China to fill. They wouldn't fill it in a military sense because it's really our military that's making their military show up. And as far as I can tell, the main activity of the Djibouti base that China has is to spy on the U.S. base in Djibouti and shine lasers in the eyes of pilots because they're bored. The Chinese, people on this base are bored and they're, they have nothing to do, right? So, and that's mostly what they're doing. I don't think, we would see sort of an unwinding of the security dilemma that the U.S. presence creates for China. If the U.S. presence decreases, their presence, I would think, at least militarily, would also decrease.
Yeah, I would say, in addition to that, what would the states in the region do if this happened in relation to U.S. competition with China? I often refer to it as reverse leverage. Countries in the region are very well aware that the United States is currently obsessed with China, and they know that this is a very lucrative card to play when trying to extract concessions from the United States. It's very much okay, well, if you're not going to give this to us, then we're going to go elsewhere. And you saw this really plainly before the October 7th attacks, with the Biden administration sprinting towards normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And they were offering unprecedented concessions in the process, namely a formal security guarantee and cooperation on a civilian nuclear program. But this idea of sealing a more formal coalition in the region to combat China was really astounding to the extent to which administration officials were very just upfront about it when you asked them that this is long-term a way to counter China. And I always point back to this really great piece in the Wall Street Journal that they were interviewing a Saudi official, and he said, very plainly, he said, yeah, we hope to leverage fears in Washington vis-a-vis China so that we can get things that we want. And they're very open about it. So my concern is the United States overreacting to this problem and then pursuing policies that are detrimental to U.S. interests, thinking that they're solving U.S.-China competition, but then what actually it does is entrap us in the Middle East and cements our commitment to these already counterproductive policies.
John, kind of along that vein of reverse leverage, many argue that even a modest role by China in the region, whether it's ports, infrastructure, or technology, could pose a long-term challenge to U.S. influence. Does the U.S. need to compete in all these sectors, or can we just simply accept that these countries are going to work simultaneously with both the U.S. and China?
Yeah, I think in an increasingly multipolar world, states are going to start sending multiple signals to multiple different actors. And the Middle East recognizes that in the short term, they're trying to play this reverse leverage strategy and get a bunch of goodies. But in the long term, they recognize that this transition to a more multipolar world is a reality. And they're trying to position themselves accordingly to benefit from it. And that means sending multiple signals to multiple actors in order to try and buttress relationships with the different poles. Whether or not the United States should engage strategically in all of these different areas that you just mentioned, no. A lot of them have very little geopolitical consequence for the United States, and it's an extension of this zero-sum framework that just tends to grab anything and everything and view it through the lens of, if we don't have it, China will get it. And no, I don't view that as a basis for solid policy in the region.
And Jennifer, you've proposed a revised U.S. military posture in the Middle East that's about a third the size of what it is now. What specific adjustments should the U.S. make?
Yeah, so Dan Caldwell and I did a global posture review. We were trying to preempt the global posture review because we thought it was going to come out soon. It still hasn't come out, so we were really early. But so what we advocate for is changes that we'd like to see over 4 years. Ultimately, as I said, I do think the United States could get down pretty close to zero. But for the next 4 years, we try to identify what should be the top priorities for the current administration in terms of reducing posture. So at the top of the list are ending U.S. force presence in Iraq and Syria pretty much entirely. These are legacy holdovers from the global war on terror. They are no longer needed. These countries can now manage any threat that remains from local insurgents as law enforcement issues primarily. So we suggest closing all the bases and getting all the forces out. That would then open up opportunities because currently a lot of the forces in Jordan and the forces in Kuwait are primarily there to support the operations in Iraq and Syria. So if you get rid of Iraq and Syria as U.S. military operations, then you can basically remove all the forces from Kuwait and significantly reduce the presence in Jordan, especially the forces that are most at risk from attacks near the border there with Syria. In addition, we suggest significantly reducing the forces at Al-Udeid Air Base. We saw over the summer how vulnerable those forces are to strikes from Iran. The base is not all that useful for that reason. There's this idea that if the U.S. has this presence in the region, we'll be able to use it in case there is a crisis. And we saw this summer that's absolutely not true. When there was a crisis, we moved the forces and the assets out of Al-Udeid Air Base, and we used assets that were located. The bombers came from the United States. The air refuelers came from Europe. So we ended up using assets that weren't even based in the region, and the assets that were in the region were targets for Iranian retaliation. So we suggest getting rid of those as well. We suggest then consolidating the rest of the presence in places like Saudi Arabia and in Jordan, where they would be a little bit more protected, and keeping the naval forces at Bahrain, which is still a very useful strategic location for the United States. In terms of carriers, we suggest that there don't really need to be carrier strike groups in the region, either in the Red Sea or in the Mediterranean. The United States actually doesn't rely on the Red Sea as for its commercial traffic. Only about 12% of U.S. trade goes through the Red Sea. So all the operations that the U.S. did, all the missiles that were wasted were primarily to benefit countries like those in Europe and China and Russia. So, that's not necessarily in U.S. strategic interests. I'm definitely a fan of better relations with both of those countries, but we certainly don't need to protect their shipping for them. And we suggest that instead, perhaps the United States might keep an Ohio-class submarine in the region that could just be used for the sake of deterrence. I think there are, that's something that we did over the summer as well. We suggest moving most of the rotational air forces out of the region as well. So this would be a significant reduction. I think it's achievable over 4 years, but as I said, I would like to see much further reduction, especially of the ground forces. I think basically you need 0, but that's not, I don't think, achievable in 4 years. That's a little bit too ambitious, maybe.
My understanding is the Global Posture Review was late because they saw yours and they had to make some changes.
I hope that's the reason. Otherwise, they're going to get some angry op-eds from me.
So one of the major arguments made by some here in D.C. In favor of at least a significant military presence in the Middle East is that although the global war on terror is, I suppose, over, counterterrorism is still a risk to U.S. national security. And Rose, you had an article, I think a couple of weeks ago, about how Afghanistan kind of serves as an example for this. Can you maybe unpack that for us?
Yeah, sure. So, the 4th anniversary of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan just passed in August and was remarked upon almost 0, right? In part because we withdrew from Afghanistan. It played out in a fiasco kind of way where there was this massive suicide bombing that killed a bunch of Afghans and 13 U.S. soldiers. But after that, nothing happened, right? We had all these warnings for years leading up to the pullout that said, well, if the United States leaves Afghanistan, al-Qaeda will reconstitute and it will become another safe haven for terrorism that they can use to perpetrate attacks on the United States or its allies in Europe. And or ISIS will do the same thing. And we've not seen any terrorist attacks from al-Qaeda or ISIS based in Afghanistan against the United States since that pullout. And so it really, that should raise huge questions in our mind about why we need to have a presence anywhere for terrorism. I mean, this was sort of the best case scenario for the terrorist sanctuary argument. It was the original sanctuary from which 9/11, was launched, right? A lot of things have changed since 2001, one of them being that the United States just has really good ISR capabilities. Like, we can detect plots from far away and use drones and other things to attack, al-Qaeda leaders or ISIS leaders without having a presence on the ground. And those attacks that have been tied to groups in recent years, so like people worry about ISIS Khorasan, which was based in Afghanistan, Pakistan. They had 2 big attacks in 2024, one against Russia and one against Iran. And in both cases, U.S. intelligence picked up those plots and warned those countries, and they didn't believe us because we're not pals with those countries, right? So we still detected those plots even though we didn't have forces on the ground. So to me, it's just it's completely obvious that we do not need to have forces there. And actually, the last major attack that came out of Afghanistan against the U.S. was that suicide bombing at the airport. Now that our troops are gone, we're not being attacked in Afghanistan anymore, right? That's a pretty simple formula for if you don't want to have terrorism against terrorism, it's not really terrorism if it's against military, but whatever. If you don't want to have insurgent attacks against U.S. forces in Syria, take them out.
So you're saying we shouldn't reoccupy Bagram?
We should not reoccupy Bagram. Yeah, no. Not necessary whatsoever.
We've talked at length, I think, about at least 2 of the traditional rationales for deep engagement in the Middle East, being oil, that the U.S. is no longer reliant, and counterterrorism. John, you've written quite a bit about kind of the myth of authoritarian stability. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think When it comes to U.S. Middle East policy, I always point towards what I call kind of the two pillars. The first is this myth of authoritarian stability, the belief that a select group of autocrats are the best way to advance American interests in the region. The second pillar is the U.S. special relationship with Israel. Regarding the first pillar, the myth of authoritarian stability, there's this idea that autocratic actors are the best guarantors of oil flowing out of the region, or the best actors to combat terrorism, and that the United States, by kind of politically engineering the region, can prevent the emergence of a regional hegemon. Again, I think all of these are wrong, kind of for examples, or for reasons that I explained earlier, but what I think is we're at such a critical moment right now because it seems as though the United States is reaching around for different reasons to remain deeply engaged in the Middle East. And the great power competition, U.S. competition with China, seems to be the card that they're reaching for. And I would argue that this current moment could serve as an opportunity for the United States to learn from the mistakes of U.S. Middle East policy, to recognize that our interests are inherently limited and easy to accomplish, and instead of doubling down on decades of failed policy, using this as a moment to pull back from the Middle East. And I really like Jen's posture review about how to do that practically. But I think also at a time when the United States is $37 trillion in debt, running $2 trillion a year deficits, tensions at home are pretty high. If this is not a recipe for why we should pull back from the Middle East, then I don't know what would be.
Yeah, if I just say one thing, I know that question was for John, but that the argument that's often made in DC these days, which is becoming more acceptable, is that the US should do less in Europe and the Middle East so it can do more in Asia. And that is not the reason to do less in Europe and the Middle East. The reason to do less in the Middle East is because it's just not in US interests. It increases the risk that the US is pulled into conflicts, it costs a lot of money, and it does not advance US strategic objectives. So, the reason to do it isn't because of Asia. That's like a convenient reason that's like politically acceptable to say now. But like the real reason to do it is because it's not in US interests.
So I do think to some extent policymakers, at least perhaps before they get into office, recognize that there are limited U.S. interests. I mean, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, the last 4 administrations campaigned on reducing America's presence in the Middle East. That goes back 17 years now to Obama in 2007, 2008. What is it that creates this policy inertia? Is it a reactivity, a desire to reassert the United States as a regional and global hegemon during crisis, or is it bureaucratic interest? What, in your assessment, what keeps us there?
I think it's all of those things. I mean, first, it's very interesting that over time, U.S. posture often increases, it rarely decreases, and that's true in all regions. It just keeps going up. We keep adding. We never actually bring anything back. Even surge forces that are surged forward for a crisis then become the new status quo. You see that elsewhere as well. It's not just in the Middle East. I do think that even though presidents run on reducing U.S. military presence in the Middle East and kind of retrenching in that way, I think once they confront the consequences of maybe they would have less influence and maybe there would be less arms sales, they get uncomfortable with having to give those things up. And so there's an unwillingness to actually take the step of pulling forces back because they like the influence, they like being the boss of the region. And then that's where the bureaucracy comes in. There's like a whole bureaucracy, whether it's the military commanders at CENTCOM who don't want to give up the power that they have, it's the defense contractors who like the sales, it's all of this. And it's then the congressmen who benefit from the military production in their districts. So there's that angle. And then there's the U.S. relationships in the region. I think it would be very difficult to retrench U.S. forces today unless the United States is willing to actually make significant changes to its relationships with countries in the region, not just Israel, which is the one that people talk about a lot, but also countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, imagine how they're going to respond, or Kuwait, how they're going to respond when the U.S. says we're closing our bases and we're going home. So this will require fundamental changes to those relationships. It doesn't have to mean abandoning them. It can mean a shifting of the relationship to economic and technology cooperation or some other type of structural relationship going forward, but it would mean a change. And until a government comes in where they're willing to actually bear the costs of changing those relationships, I see changes in force posture as very difficult to accomplish.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's, it's a mystery, right? I mean, it's genuinely kind of mysterious. Like, how do we end up in this situation? And I think there's something like a just-in-case logic that's going on. And I think it was actually really brave, and I can give two presidents credit for it. Like, it was really brave of Trump to negotiate a peace deal with the Taliban. It was really brave of Biden to carry it out by actually withdrawing from Afghanistan. Because you figure, if you look at it from the point of view of the president, you have not a ton to gain and a lot to potentially lose, right? I think there is this sense that, like, well, it's relatively low cost for the U.S. We've been able to keep it going at relatively low cost for a long period of time. And so if I don't rock the boat, I can't be blamed for anything that's happened. But if I do pull troops out and then something bad happens, I will get blamed for that, right? And it did hurt Biden's popularity after the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan. Now, it didn't cause Biden or the Democrats, like, it didn't cost an election for them, right? So I'm not sure ultimately how important it was, but it didn't help his popularity when he withdrew, right? And so there's this sense of, like, there's only something that you can lose from it, and ultimately you have to be willing to pay or run some kind of short-term risk for the long-term benefit of not continuing to just pour resources into this in a way that is going to hurt people 20 years from now, but doesn't affect you or in your 4-year electoral window.
Yeah, there's an overbearing mindset in Washington, D.C., rooted in American primacy. For a lot of people in Washington, they can't even fathom the United States playing a lesser role in the Middle East or the world. And that is where the real policy inertia is. Cato's kind of rare. But the real policy inertia is behind this push for deep engagement and towards status quo policies. There's also tremendous political costs, as has been mentioned. A lot of politicians don't want to pay the costs when it comes to disengaging from the Middle East because special interests will come for them almost immediately. And these countries in the Middle East, not just Israel, but Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar, all these countries pour massive amounts of money into Washington, D.C. in direct lobbying, indirectly through lobbying of think tanks, academic programs, and so on. So there's a tremendous amount of money at stake here, not even talking about the military-industrial complex and so on, that makes it so the political costs of changing course are incredibly high compared to just stamping another arms deal or stamping another troop deployment.
Yeah, I do sometimes wonder, if there's ever been a CENTCOM commander who said, no, EUCOM's more important, Indo-PACOM's more important, don't give me more tools. I think the bureaucratic survival element of it is at least at DoD is certainly, I think there's a lot of explanative power there. So with that, we're going to move to Q&A from both our audience in person and online. For those in person, just please wait for the microphone, state your name and affiliation if you have one, and please speak clearly into the microphone. And we'll also take some questions from our online audience. And just a reminder, if you're watching online, you could submit those through the event webpage on Facebook, YouTube, or X. In addition, if the questions could come in the form of a question, that would be preferable, so our panel has the opportunity to respond. I do understand also that there's a lot to chew on in the Middle East contemporarily, but there's a lot to be discussed in the context of great power competition, so we do want to narrowly focus on that aspect. We'll start with an online question. For two reasons, because this question was in the queue online before we started the panel, and the person is in person as well. So I thought we'd start with them. John Gay asks, how decisive would a U.S. interdiction campaign against Chinese sea lanes of communications from the Middle East be in a U.S.-China conflict?
Well, thank you for your question, John. And thank you for sending it before the event even started. That's impressive. You were just speaking about CENTCOM. The former head of CENTCOM, Eric Kurilla, this was in many ways his argument, saying, okay, I understand all these traditional interests aren't really the case anymore, but hey, if we get into a hot war with China, we want to be able to control these waterways in order to block their access. First, and Rose has written about this for decades, about how this just, one, misunderstands the global oil market. Two, 70% of China's oil traverses through the Malacca Strait. So in theory, if you were actually trying to block or interdict Chinese oil imports, that would be much more lucrative. And third, it doesn't require the massive U.S. presence that we have in the Middle East. Such an operation could be conducted augmenting forces already stationed at Diego Garcia, for example.
Okay, so I guess I disagree with that.
Yeah.
I actually think it would be incredibly difficult to block China from receiving oil in a way that would actually affect the conflict, like a hot war with China, for a couple of reasons. The first is that if we're in a hot war with China, most U.S. naval power is going to have to be devoted to the hot war with China. We can't devote a lot of naval power to them blocking sea lanes to interdict oil. Blockades are incredibly difficult to carry out, because you don't actually know where the ships are coming, and even if you can spot them using ISR aircraft, then you have to get your ships in position to block them. The Chinese ships are not going to be the only ships. Determining which are Chinese flagged, which are going to China, this would be complicated. The risks of bombing a civilian ship by accident, or a friendly vessel by accident, would be quite high. Some actors wouldn't care about that. For the United States, that would be a big deal. If we right now we're bombing boats in Latin America, but the reputational consequences could be quite high, depending. And you'd need key access locations. The Malacca Strait would be a key place. So I actually think that this is sort of a preposterous idea, just because the actual military capacity required to do it correctly would exceed the amount of capacity available, not in the whole U.S. Navy, but given the fact that we're also fighting a hot war with China. China could also, they've done significant planning for this type of contingency. They have figured out how long they could last by rationing oil, and it's a really long time, a lot longer than the U.S. could maintain a blockade, given stockpiles of the types of ammunition they would need, the types of torpedoes and things they would need to keep those sea lanes closed if they were successful in setting up a blockade at all. And they can get oil through overland routes. Not that would replace the maritime, but it would be enough then to extend that even further. So the bottom line is, I'm not really sure the U.S. could do it in any sort of way that would affect Chinese fighting capacity, especially as we have this EV argument that they're actually less dependent on oil in the first place. So to me, this argument just falls apart in all places.
Yeah, what they said.
I was going to say, a lot of head nodding, Rose. Anything to add?
Yeah, no, it's totally right. The only times that a country has really succeeded in cutting off another country from oil militarily, well, first of all, the only way to cut it off is militarily, because markets are just so good at rerouting oil. If you do it with trade policy, people just get around it, right? But the only time it's worked militarily is against Japan and against Britain, both of which are islands that don't have any oil in them, right? Which is not the situation of China, right? China actually has a significant domestic oil production capability and huge amounts of overland routes to, the Middle East, to Kazakhstan, to Russia, et cetera, right? They can just turn around and buy it from somebody else. Easy, done.
So we'll turn to our in-person audience. Sir?
Hi, William Lawrence, National Council on U.S. Arab Relations and American University, and Georgetown in the spring, adjuncting. Brilliant panel. I love not only how you are unraveling the great competition argument, but also the pivot to Asia argument. The statistics are great. I can say also, as a former State Department official, I was in state for over 11 years. Whenever I was trying to get a policy approved, I would do what I call wave the red flag. Congress would almost never approve a new policy until I went and said China was doing something, and then they would. That was the only argument that would work with Congress, and that's part of that knee-jerk thing. I don't think, as a former diplomat, that my hundreds of colleagues that I knew at State at the time were really mystified about any of these issues. I don't think policymakers in general are confused about what you're talking about. I think it's rather the interests you absolutely correctly identified that keeps us locked into these frames, along with the historical trajectory. It's not just policymakers. But my question is related to the last question, but it's a little different. When I'm worried about China in the world and China in the Middle East, I'm more worried about China's domination of global commercial sea activity. I mean, they control all the ships, they control the flagging now, they control global commerce in huge ways. And the U.S. Commercial fleet, for many reasons, including, I guess, overinterpretation of the Jones Act, that it's just withered away. We don't have enough ships now to mobilize in wartime, even from our commercial fleet. So when you guys look at the sort of global posture vis-a-vis China, how much are you worried about the way in which China dominates global commerce at sea? And is the answer what I think Trump said a couple of times, just building a lot more ships, or like what? How do we get out from under that constraint?
So, I mean, I do think that the United States needs to increase its shipbuilding capacity, but I think it's primarily for the commercial space, not necessarily for the military space. Like, I don't think we need a bigger Navy. I think that, I think that the discussion around the threat that China poses to the United States and Washington, D.C. is very, very inflated. China has never shown any indication that it wants to shut global shipping lanes. In fact, China is quite dependent on trade. And so shutting commerce and restricting commerce in that way, even with just the United States, which is still its biggest trading partner, would be quite detrimental. I mean, we see that with one of the reasons why this whole tariff war keeps starting and stopping is that neither country can sustain it because it's quite economically devastating. And any kind of, trying to use the trade weapon would be similarly economically difficult for both countries. So I guess I don't really see that as being something that's in in China's interests. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't think that that is an area where the United States needs to focus its energy on, making sure that it does have its own commercial shipping capacity, thinking about, does it have the right commercial ports, things like that. But often the shipbuilding conversation in Washington just gets siphoned off into we need more warships, we need a bigger destroyer, we need to be able to build more submarines. We do need more submarines, but I think that to the extent that we have this shipbuilding conversation, it really should be about commercial capacity and also making sure that we have the right types of people to man those ships, And I think this is a global challenge as well. I've done some work on, this isn't the focus of today's panel, but on, what would happen if there were to be a blockade of Taiwan. And the fact that we don't have any kind of merchant marine soldiers that could be activated in this situation is a limit, because you'd have to find people who are willing, likely Taiwanese people who are willing to run the risk of running a blockade. I'm not signing up for that. Some people might. But so I do think that there's a whole range of issues around this commercial shipping that is worth discussing. But that's, I think, separate from the military question. And to me, that's I don't worry so much about the port infrastructure. That's another argument that people make, especially with regards to the Middle East, to bring it back to today's region, is that China controls all these ports, and that is necessarily a threat. As I said before, I think that's mostly an economic strategy, not that useful for military purposes.
Yeah, I'll just say that there's no shortage of thoughts on the Jones Act here at the Cato Institute. And it's been highlighted quite often that China, in a single shipyard, has 232 times the shipbuilding capacity that we have in the entirety of the U.S. But where there are opportunities to leverage allies, we probably should. South Korea has a very capable maritime industrial base. Japan is another. This is on the military. Finland, we just bought, 8 new icebreakers from them after spending years in kind of an abysmal approach, just not being able to build these things, and we bought them on the relative cheap, and they'll be built quicker. So leveraging allies is certainly an opportunity there. So we'll take another one from the audience here. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, my name is Miriam Latif Estefan. I'm actually a student of Professor Hoffman. I had a question in more so regards to the military presence, reducing the military presence in regards to keeping their security concerns. So like you're saying, the U.S. has very inflated concerns about their security relations with countries in the Middle East. If they were to reduce their presence in the region, how would they be able to still maintain the so-and-so security relations that they have with countries such as Israel, or maintaining that sense of or superiority to the other countries in the region?
So I would say it would take, and I think Jen mentioned this earlier, it would take restructuring these relationships, whether it be with Israel or whether it be with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt. That being said, what I would say is the amount of special interests at play in restructuring these relationships is primarily the biggest hindrance. And when I often look at U.S. force posture in the region, there's always this argument that U.S. military presence stabilizes and it deters. But I think it's pretty obvious that for a number of reasons, our presence in the region destabilizes and often incites. But again, to distance itself from these actors in the region will take a tremendous amount of political will. The gentleman here just mentioned a lot of policymakers are kind of hip to the fact that, this is kind of the case, but it comes down to often a question of political will.
Yeah, I think two points. The first is that I don't think we should underestimate how capable a lot of countries would be to defend themselves if they had to. I mean, Israel has a nuclear triad. Do they really need the United States to protect them? I don't think so. If we look at the other allies in the region, I mean, the Saudis are really rich. They've bought so much U.S. military equipment and received training. To me, it's just incomprehensible how they are not capable of defending themselves. I don't understand. I don't understand where the money and weapons have gone. So I think if the United States pulled back, I really believe countries would figure out what they had to do to defend themselves, especially when they clearly have the resources to do so. And then on the question of, I guess to me, it's just not important that the U.S. maintain this superiority. I think the U.S. could protect its security without having primacy. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. The U.S. homeland can be secure, its economic interests can be secure, the United States can be one of many great powers in the world. That would be a perfectly fine outcome for me, especially if it meant a smaller military and more domestic investment in priorities at home. To me, that would be a much better outcome than the current situation where we're spending $1 trillion on military things that happen far away and don't actually help U.S. security, and then shortchanging things like education and roads. And I would really like a train on the East Coast that runs when it's hot.
Yeah, simple ask. I think there's also who are we defending these countries from anyway, right? Defend them from who? The Soviets, well, they're gone. The Chinese, they're not even there. Right? Other countries in the region, all the countries in the region are frankly pretty weak. The biggest country that people worry about is Iran. Iran has no power projection capabilities at all, right? They can't take and hold territories. So, there's nobody to protect these countries from. But I think there's also just this misunderstanding of what is required for U.S. security, which touches on what actually both of you have been saying, which is the U.S. doesn't need to have primacy in the region. We just need to make sure nobody else has primacy in the region. That was the whole crux of the Cold War. We wanted to make sure that the Soviets couldn't dominate the region, and we were able to do that by arming proxies, right? We armed the Shah of Iran to the teeth to keep the Soviets out, and it worked until he got overthrown, right? When he was overthrown is when we started getting more involved directly, but then we just pivoted to the Iraqis to help try to contain the Iranians, right? Not necessarily the smartest strategy as it turned out, but the fact of the matter is the only thing that would threaten the U.S. in the region would be if there was one country that consolidated control over the whole region and over all of its oil supplies. Maybe that would threaten the United States, but there's no country that can do that, right? There's no external power that can do it, and there's no internal power that can do it. So why are we there at all? Why should we care if any of these countries see us as allies or as, the top dog or person in charge or whatever? They can, as long as they're divided and they can defend themselves, which they can from nobody, then we're good.
And that's the key, is that they are divided and they are competitive and they don't really trust each other. So if the U.S. left, they would balance each other. That wouldn't be a bad outcome.
Right.
Rose, I think what you were describing earlier in your remarks sounds a lot like racketeering. But just to hop in on the audience questions here, because I think we were teetering around it, but a lot of the times in D.C., this idea of primacy and U.S. security are almost used as synonyms. Could it be the case that primacy actually puts the U.S. more at risk than if it had more limited aims in the world?
Yeah, I mean, if you don't mind my jumping to that, I mean, it definitely puts the U.S. at risk because primacy is expensive, right? And if we're spending all these resources now, that's resources we're foregoing for later, right? Or just for growth in the future or growth now, right? So there's the risk of kind of, imperial overexpansion, or this idea that great powers rise and fall, and one of the reasons why they fall is that they overspend at their apex and then crash down through, debt and internal problems, right? So there's a risk of that. But then also, just by having a presence in these places, we tend to get drawn into things that if we weren't there, we wouldn't care about, right? And again, the Afghanistan withdrawal, I think just goes to show how much it helps to not have a presence there, right? Afghanistan, what happens in Afghanistan doesn't matter to the United States, right? We're thousands of miles away. So yeah, there are huge risks both in sort of the long-term balance of power, sort of economic determinants of power, and putting those, mortgaging our future, right? But B, making ourselves targets when it's completely unnecessary.
Yeah, there's also the spiral element of this, so the escalation spiral, as Rose was talking about, how the U.S. presence in the Middle East, if China sees it as threatening, that's the reason why they moved, to increase their presence in the Middle East. And this dynamic works in other regions as well. When the U.S. tries to maintain primacy in Asia, this is where it puts a lot of emphasis on Taiwan and, has trainers on Taiwan and long-range missiles that can shoot into mainland China. And this increases the risk of a catastrophic nuclear war with China. Same thing in Europe. Part of the reason that we're all entangled in Ukraine is because there's concern about Russian influence in Europe, and the U.S. has to maintain primacy and keep adversaries down. And ultimately, in my view, the more hard power we surge into the world, the more other countries build up their militaries. And now the U.S. hasn't really gained anything in deterrence, and we've moved up the escalation ladder so that when a war does happen, it's even more catastrophic than it was before. So to me, this is just a self-defeating strategy that increases the risk of war, not decreasing it, and puts everyone at risk.
This is often what Cato is known for, but also this idea of primacy and this incredibly hyper-aggressive foreign policy abroad also has very real domestic ramifications for civil liberties, mass warrantless surveillance of American citizens, detention and even killing of American citizens abroad without due process. There are real ramifications here. The founders were very warned very much about how hyper-aggressive foreign policies can strengthen the executive branch, and now to the point where the presidency is almost deified. So there are ramifications of these policies abroad that often come home very quickly.
So let's go back to our in-person audience here.
Hello, Cindy Regab from American University. I have a question about how competitive we are with China in the Middle East on issues that aren't directly security related. So in terms of competing on establishing trade routes, economic development, like industrialization projects, it seems like that's where China's focusing more on carrots rather than sticks, which might have been our previous strategy. To what extent are we also pivoting or competing in that area?
I think that is a huge amount of what's going on, but I also think that portraying it as competing is mistaken, right? Which isn't, that's sort of how it is broadly portrayed, right? But certainly in the Middle East, but in many places in the world where China is doing massive investments, it's not clear they're making any money off of these deals, right? They seem to be doing it for purposes of influence in ways that I personally find very puzzling, right? Investing in building a giant new port in Sri Lanka. I know it's not in the region, but it's kind of like one of these examples of China, building infrastructure that doesn't make a whole lot of sense and isn't going to make them a lot of money, right? So there's something beyond market dynamics at work that the Chinese seem to think that they're gaining influence, I think, because I don't have a good explanation for why they're doing it otherwise. But I'm not sure what they think that influence buys them or why the US would care about that, right? So there's some competing for influence. Is there competing for genuine market stuff? Well, I mean, if we're a market economy, we should just let our businesses make those decisions. That's what markets do, not the government. So I guess I'm channeling. It's the ethos of being in Cato and having the Cato logo right at my feet. That it's really this is not what free markets are, right? And if it's a free market, competition's good for everybody because consumers end up getting better products at lower prices, and we are a nation of consumers, if nothing else. So
I think there is competition in the AI and tech space. That's one area that I do think there is genuine competition, including in the Middle East. Over because I guess the U.S. view has been that countries must choose between Chinese technology and U.S. technology. Whereas countries now globally, especially in the Middle East, don't want to choose. They want to use both. They want to use whatever's better, and they want to mix them together. Now, there are some legitimate security concerns, about sharing certain types of technology, if China has other types of technology and could steal trade secrets or other types of things. So, there is some legitimate, reason to be paying attention to these deals. But ultimately, I think it's unreasonable for the United States, number one, to say you can't do X with China when the U.S. has no alternative, right? You can't use Huawei. You can only use the U.S. system, which is 5 times as expensive and actually doesn't serve your needs. That's unreasonable. If the U.S. wants to compete, it actually has to compete, as Rose is suggesting. And number two, I think generally the United States, and this goes back to something John said, we have to be comfortable with the fact that countries that we don't live in a world like the Soviet in the Cold War when countries sort of had to choose to be in the U.S. bloc or the Soviet bloc. That's not today's world. Today's world is much more multipolar. Power is diffused. The military power is diffused, as is economic power. Small countries have a lot more choices. They can choose to work with the United States. They can choose to work with China. They can choose to work with both. They can choose to work with middle powers like India. And the United States has to be comfortable and adapt to this new world. Otherwise, it's going to lose out in a lot of ways because countries aren't willing to sign up to a U.S. security bloc. And this is a mistake I think the Biden administration made. They called it a networked security architecture, but that's basically a security bloc, right? It just sounds fancy. And countries didn't want to join. Why? Of course not, because they can gain so much more by playing the countries against each other.
So we'll take another one from online. This is a question about the Chinese-Russian relationship, and if there's anything that the U.S. can offer China to assist them in splitting that relationship up.
You're never going to divorce Russia and China. If you talk to the Chinese, you talk to the Russians, they make it clear. You're never going to drive them apart. There's no reverse Kissinger to be had. What you can do, though, is improve U.S. relations with the two countries. And that can help to, number one, reduce the threat to the United States, and number two, give these countries more options so they're no longer so dependent on each other. And other countries in this axis that Rose was talking about, North Korea, Iran. One of the reasons why these countries cooperate so closely is because the United States has shut them out using sanctions and other things, driving them together. If you give them more options, they also want a balance. And so to me, this idea that you're going to divorce them, it's not going to happen. That doesn't mean, though, that they have this no limits friendship. There are clear limits to how far they're willing to go for each other, as we were discussing before.
Another question straight in the back there.
Hi, thanks. My name's Ted. I'm with Stand Together Trust. My question is just maybe some broad reflections from the panelists about a couple events that have happened. Changes in Syria, maybe your thoughts on what that means for U.S.-China competition and maybe how Syria is looking to both Beijing and Washington as they're going through their governance transition. And then the other question is just, it looks like we have a ceasefire between Israel and Gaza. Every day it holds is a really great day, in my opinion. But what are maybe countries in the Middle East looking for from both Washington and Beijing when it comes to being involved in maybe keeping this size fair, deepening it, that sort of things?
I can take the Israel-Gaza one. I think Beijing's role here is almost non-existent. This is Washington's show. This is Trump's show, the ceasefire and so on. But throughout the war, it was interesting because it highlighted Beijing's strategy of compartmentalization and staying above the geopolitical conflicts in the region. You often saw China inviting a lot of Arab leaders to Beijing, talking about their 5-point plan or whatever it is to solve Israel-Palestine, talking about the need for a two-state solution, so on and so forth. But again, Beijing has no desire to get up to their necks in this conflict or others in the region, similar to the way that the United States has. They don't want to enforce agreements. They don't want to police agreements. And insofar as the ceasefire holds, I agree every day that the ceasefire holds is another good day. But I think China also has an interest in regional de-escalation as well. It's just their leverage in this conflict is just not even anything close to what the United States currently possesses.
Yeah, I mean, I just tend to think that neither Syria nor Israel-Palestine is particularly important for China. And honestly, I don't think either is particularly important to the United States, except insofar as, Trump has decided to make them important to the United States, right? And Syria is kind of like his pet project in certain ways, right? And maybe it could be a demonstration. There could be a demonstration effect of, we've lifted sanctions on Syria. We are, I wouldn't go so far as to say we're helping them rebuild, but we're trying to, keep other countries in the region from meddling in Syria quite as much as in the past, with, mixed success on that one, right? But Syria is sometimes seen as like, this is the model for how relations between U.S. and Iran could improve, right? And so if you have this success story coming out of Syria, wouldn't that be great? And wouldn't it give an incentive for Iran to then also want to come to the negotiating table and get sanctions taken off and all these sorts of things? I don't think any of that would be bad from the point of view of China per se either. So I just don't think of them as really central issues, even though, we have decided to care about them in the United States.
So you're saying that Trump, similar to how he called Shara handsome, should
Yes.
call Khamenei handsome, and maybe this will get back to the negotiating table?
Yeah, I mean, if he was hot, young, and charismatic,
Hey.
things might be different. But that is not the world in which we live, right? So,
Many such cases.
yeah.
So we've exhausted our online questions. Before we move to closing thoughts from our panelists, any last questions from the audience here? John?
John Gay, again. I've got a question about weapon sales, especially Chinese weapon sales in the region. I don't know that China is with Russia in agreement that UNSCR 2231 has expired and they can sell whatever weapons they want to Tehran. But I do wonder how concerned we should be about the prospect of a significant Chinese-driven rearmament of Iran post-12-day war, or more broadly about the provision of Chinese weapons to different players in the region, integrating them into some of their defense technical architecture. Because it seems like the recent Indo-Pakistan clashes have put a real shine on Chinese weapons and systems.
Yeah, I'd say one, to just start and frame the conversation. So Chinese arms sales comprise about 5% of overall arms sales to the Middle East. To the Gulf countries, it's 2%. So whereas I think it was Rose who mentioned it earlier, we often hear, oh, Chinese arms sales increased by 80% this year to the Middle East. It still represents an incredibly small margin of the actual weapons that are flowing into the region. Regarding the buildup of Iran, on China-Iran relations writ large, it was interesting, and this narrative was really prevalent before October 7th and kind of the previous years. There was this idea of a China-Iran axis, and so on and so forth. But when you look at China's engagement with, say, Saudi Arabia or the UAE, it dwarfs its engagement with Iran. I would say that there's still this exaggeration of the extent to which Beijing and Tehran are aligned.
Yeah, I mean, there are also structural limitations to how much China can actually sell. Its arms industry is becoming more export focused, but historically has not been export focused. It's been focused on arming China's military. So in order to become a major arms seller, China will have to continue to shift its arms production towards this export markets. Now, it is doing that to some extent, and it has had some big high-profile sales, especially of its fighter jets by certain countries. I think, so I guess I'm not that concerned, primarily because there are these structural limits. Second, I'm not sure that the takeaway lesson from the India-Pakistan thing is that Chinese weapons did so much better. We actually have very few data points. It was a very short campaign, so I'm not sure that's the message that a lot of countries are taking. One of the reasons why countries are turning more towards Chinese weapons is, number one, they're cheaper, and number two, they don't come with as many strings attached as US weapons do in terms of limitations and human rights requirements and things like that. I think that the Chinese have already been willing to sell things to the region that the United States has not, such as the drone technology and the ballistic missiles to the Saudis is a good example. But looking at Iran specifically, I mean, number one, I think it's a little bit hypocritical of the United States to worry about like other countries selling arms to countries that we don't like when the United States sells arms to everyone and gets itself entangled in all these conflicts. And number two, I think that we've seen with Russia that China actually is quite careful in terms of what it's doing and how its arms sales to Russia have stuck quite clearly to sanctions and limitations. Like China has not done everything that it could. If China really wanted to support Russia, it could do a lot more. And the Russians actually complain about this sometimes, that China hasn't done more, that China hasn't given it more lethal technologies. So, I think it's something to watch, but I guess it's not something that I'm super concerned about, especially given the fact that they provided zero support in the context of the war. I think Russia selling technology to Iran is a much bigger concern, and there I worry less about like production, like selling actual hardware, and more about sharing of technology.
So I think we've got time to squeeze in one last question here.
Two quick lightning round questions. For, I guess, Rose, when we talk about China's interests, we often use to make this argument that the whole panel is making, we should look at them geoeconomically, sort of having geoeconomic goals rather than geostrategic goals. Is that a term you like? I think it encapsulates some of these things, but maybe masks other things. And then for Jennifer, you've convinced me on a lot of things, but one thing you haven't convinced me on entirely is on counterterrorism. So I'm thinking about the next ISIS, the next Al Qaeda, how we put the ISIS coalition together, a lot of assets out of Turkey. So I'm just wondering, you obviously have clearly thought about these things. How do you prepare for the U.S. response to the next big wave of terrorism?
The next ISIS, aren't they the cartels?
What's that?
I thought we already had them, the cartels, right? Yeah. Anyway, Rose, you go first.
Well, I don't like geo terms in general, like geostrategic or geoeconomic or geopolitics. I think is thrown in to make something sound highfalutin and nobody really knows what it means. Like that's sort of my knee-jerk reaction to it. But yeah, I do think it's true that their interests are more sort of economic than political, and their economic interests are not opposed to ours particularly, right? Because they're in the giant oil market bathtub that we share with them.
Let's get the mic for the.
China free rides on our counterterrorism strategy. They have not been critical of our strategies against ISIS and Al Qaeda. So, China actually looks at those threats after all the Chinese killed in terrorist actions and Chinese kidnapped. They actually sort of like to free ride and support a lot of our counterterrorism.
Well, I'm sure they do like to free ride off of our military power. I mean, they do it in a lot of ways. I'm not really that interested, though, in supporting their counterterrorism. So, I think of this in terms of U.S. interests. If they want to do counterterrorism, they're welcome to have at it. But, I guess my view here is that, could there be another terrorist threat like ISIS equivalent that actually, I'm not 100% sure that I would agree that ISIS posed like an existential threat to the United States, but, could something like this emerge again that has the capability to strike the U.S. homeland? Like, I would only be concerned about a group that could actually strike the U.S. homeland, and I was confident that they could. Could something like that emerge? Maybe, but we would see it coming. It's not going to just we wake up one day and it's there. So for the near term, we have very good intelligence. As Rose indicated, the United States has been, since 9/11, extremely effective in identifying terrorist plots targeting the homeland. So I have real confidence in U.S. intelligence being able to identify these threats. And I am very supportive of increased resources for the intelligence agencies to do a better job of, continue to do a good job and even expand their activities to make sure that we can identify these. Number two, we have over-horizon capabilities. We can strike these groups from far away. So if something did emerge, we could eliminate it. And we would have a long lead time were we to need to build a coalition and send U.S. military forces in again. And so, in my writing elsewhere, I'm not advocating that the U.S. get rid of its military entirely. So you would need to maintain the capabilities to respond in a crisis. But a lot of that could be done with reserve forces that you call up. So I guess I see, history tells us that when a threat emerges, we usually do have lead time. And even if we don't, even if we end up making the decision at the last minute to mobilize, we can actually ramp up military capacity quite quickly. And so I guess I'm confident that even if we pull back, even if we draw down, we will maintain the capabilities to respond were a threat to emerge in the future. And that's why I don't recommend closing all bases. Some people do. Some people who are in the restraint family argue that we should close all military bases. I'm not so sure about that. I think there's a value to maintaining naval capabilities and some airfields that you can access because you don't know when you might need those to operate strategically. But I would advocate reducing long-term permanent ground presence, not to bring it home or not to pivot it to Asia, but to cut it and save the resources.
So we've got time for maybe 60 seconds each of closing thoughts, but so if you can summarize your thesis on great power competition in the Middle East in 60 seconds, John, what would it be?
It's not real. No, I would just say it's another attempt to superimpose a grand narrative on U.S. Middle East policy to justify the status quo. And I think it's not a good idea. I think it's wildly divorced from reality. I think what's really driving this is bureaucratic inertia, policy inertia, special interests, and so on. But it's truly divorced from any notion of U.S. strategic interests.
Yeah, so I would say, the good news is China can't threaten the United States and the Middle East. But that's also, in some ways, the bad news, which is there's nobody to save us from ourselves, right? There's nobody that can check us from our own excesses. And the reason why we have all of these troops there and all these bases there that we never had during the Cold War is because the Soviets wouldn't have stood for it. And now that threat is gone, right? And it's good that the Soviet threat is gone. But it means that it's ultimately up to us to restrain ourselves from getting over-involved in a region that, by the way, is like quicksand and draws us in further, right? Nobody can check us from that except for ourselves, and we're not doing a very good job of doing that so far.
I would say that China is not a challenger for military hegemony in the Middle East. It has no interest in being a military hegemon in the Middle East. The United States does not need forward military presence in the Middle East to compete with China or to protect U.S. interests, and we should endeavor to bring all the forces home as soon as possible.
So with that, that concludes our discussion. I didn't mention it, but on the way in, for those in the in-person audience, there were 3 different readings I'd highly encourage. And for those in the online audience, I think you could probably find them via Google, but it was Jennifer's Aligning Global Military Posture with U.S. Interests, Rose's paper on China Can't Dominate the Middle East, and John's paper, Aimless Rivalry, The Futility of U.S.-China Competition in the Middle East. I think they really do a great job of laying out the arguments and much of the discussion that we had today. So I couldn't recommend it enough. If you're in person and didn't grab one on the way in, please do grab one on the way out. Thank you to our panelists today for joining us. Thanks for everybody joining us online and in person. For those of you in person, please do join us for a light reception here in our winter garden. Thank you so much.